You missed them. January 13th, risk reducing strategies for schools post COVID-19. It was a rounding success. And February 10th, economic impact of sea level rise and storm surge in the tri-state region and a consequence of a no action scenario. Extremely informative. So if you come back for more because you attended either or both, welcome back. Here today, we are with Resilience, Sustainability, and the Future of Codes. We have Ryan Colker, VP of Innovation for the Alliance for National and Community Resilience, under the national auspices of the ICC, International Code Council. He testifies for us for our own benefit before Congress and searching for the all elusive species of federal funding. And we also have with us Peter Adams, Senior Policy Advisor from the New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency, MOR, to present resiliency codes enacted temporarily after Superstorm Sandy 9 years ago and now codified permanently. More on these two presenters in just a bit, but just continuing on the remaining parts of our series on April 14th, we're going to have a rating system for resilient building design. This is exciting, whereas codes are minimal compliance and legal standards, the bottom line, so to speak. Rating systems kind of up the ante, and achieving ratings are for those firms who find resilience a desirable marketing aspect. May 12th is the future of military engineering for resilience. What's up for us in mitigation measures being constructed or planned by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers as funded out of Washington and is implemented by New York District. June 9th is the science of storm surge reduction. It's going to be a discussion of the world of outer harbor gates as implemented in other countries and here in other U.S. states and cities, and what a similar solution could look like if it were in New York Harbor. As you know, registration is a nominal fee of $10 for USGBC and SAME members, $15 for the general public. And you know what? We're considering a seventh in our series, a summit to be held in September. We envision a full day of worthwhile sessions. Participants can log in to their interest level as the day progresses. We're thinking of having a wonderful keynote speaker to kick us off. We're thinking possibly to refresh the 6 series topics we've had with an update, possibly bringing in the opposition to data we presented for an open debate. We have a list of options for sessions in this series in your satisfaction survey at the end of the session, and we'd appreciate it if you would just indicate your interest first to hold a September summit, and if so, we'd appreciate hearing any suggestions from you. Check all that apply, or fill in your own suggestions. Medea, do you have any guidance for our audience?
Well, that survey is going to come out in an email from me after the event. Hello, and also I just want to share, let me see if I can share my screen for a second. Yeah. We have GBCI approval, and there it is. So I will send out certificates for GBCI if you told me in the registration that you wanted that. And if you think you forgot to tell me in the registration, just drop me an email. And I can stop sharing. And that's it. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, so let me get into introductions now. We have Ryan Colker. Ryan is Vice President for Innovation at the International Code Council, ICC. He serves as Executive Director for the Alliance for National and Community Resilience, that's called ANCR, as a national coalition working to provide communities with the tools necessary to holistically assess and improve their resilience. It's a good thing. Prior to joining ICC, Colker served as Vice President at the National Institute of Building Sciences, where he led efforts to improve the built environment through the collaboration of public and private sector industry stakeholders. At NIBS, he directed the Consultative Council, which develops findings and recommendations on behalf of the entire building community. He speaks and writes frequently and is the editor of his own book, Optimizing Community Infrastructure, Resilience in the Face of Shocks and Stresses. Previously, he served as Manager of Government Affairs for ASHRAE, as program director for the Renewable National Resources Foundation. He graduated from George Washington University Law School and holds a BA with honors in environmental policy from the University of Florida. And we have Peter Adams. Hi, Peter. Peter is a senior policy advisor in the Mayor's Office of Resiliency, MOR, where he leads the development of future flood maps and design standards to mitigate climate risk. Prior to joining the mayor's office, Peter worked at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey as a client resilience specialist in the engineering department. Previously, Peter was a project manager at Climatize, a consultancy that specializes in climate adaptation. Peter has spent 10 years working with governments, corporations, development organizations, and indigenous communities on strategies to address risk from extreme weather and climate change. He holds a master's in geography from McGill University, where his graduate thesis was on South Asian water resources management in a changing climate. So here we have Ryan from Washington, D.C., and Peter from New York City, together with their spectacular presentation.
Great, thanks so much, and definitely appreciate the opportunity to be with you here today to talk about sustainability, resilience, and the future of codes. I'm going to provide a sort of a national level perspective on some of the activities that are going on within the resilience and sustainability landscape, with a particular focus on how codes are rising to the occasion to meet these current challenges. And then Peter will provide a little bit of sort of local context around how New York City and other communities can address these important issues on the ground. I think it's important to first maybe provide a little bit of perspective on the International Code Council and particularly the opportunity that we have to look across all of the various different aspects of resilience and really support initiatives that are going on at the state and local level. So folks are probably most familiar with the Code Council through our development of model building codes, which are then adopted at the state and local level. But we also offer a whole host of different services that support communities in the adoption process, whether that's education and training, personnel certification, product evaluations, accreditations. But we also work in other areas in support of community initiatives around codification and administrative services, engineering support, development of community resilience benchmarks, which I'll talk about through our effort at the Alliance for National and Community Resilience, and then third-party evaluation services, including plan review and inspections. So, I always like to sort of start out with an introduction to, why are we talking about resilience? Why has resilience become, such an important topic? Why have we seen sort of a growing concern around resilience? And so, the first couple slides here hopefully will tell that tale. This is a map of the disasters in 2020 that caused $1 billion of damage or more. And as you can see, they're pretty spread across the country, various different types, whether that's hurricanes, severe storms, tornadoes, drought, wildfires, hail. And in fact, these disasters in the U.S. caused or actually reached, the highest number of disasters causing $1 billion of damage or more. And you can also find, sort of similar maps for prior years with, the sort of the same level of diversity of events themselves and, sort of spread across the country. As I mentioned, 2020 actually set the record for the number of events causing $1 billion of damage or more, shattering the previous records that we saw of 2011 and 2017, where we saw 16 such events. I think another important aspect sort of this conversation is that, this is tracking just the events that cause $1 billion of damage or more. So there are certainly a whole slew of other events that occur at a more localized level that don't have this level of sort of monetary impact. But you can imagine the impact that those events still have on communities, on livelihoods. And so, there's certainly a much bigger picture behind this discussion as well. The two graphs on the right of your screen, the top one is the cost that these billion-dollar disasters bear. And as you'll see, the purple line is 2017, which saw over $300 billion in damages from these events. The colored lines, represent pretty recent years. And so as you can see, in sort of recent time, the cost of these events has grown considerably. The bottom graph is actually the number of events. Again, the colored lines representing, pretty recent activity. You see, 2020 in the red line there. As I mentioned, $22 billion disasters. And so, what the map previously and these two graphs really show is that we can't continue to operate business as usual. When we look to federal, state, or local governments to assist in recovery, number one, there's just not enough dollars there to continue to recover from these events. Certainly the capacity from a personnel standpoint is stressed as well. And so we really need to figure out a way to get ahead of these disasters, hopefully sort of dip the curve down and really, address these needs, in advance of any sort of event. And that really brings us, to the concept of resilience as really that strategy to get ahead of the events. Folks may be familiar with a study that was actually done back in 2005 on the benefits of investing, ahead of a disaster event. Some people call it the 4-to-1 study, the mitigation save study. I think an important thing to note on that 2005 study was that it was really looking at just a thin slice of the opportunities to address mitigation. So it just looked at FEMA-funded projects through grants. But recently, the National Institute of Building Sciences identified the need to update and expand the study to really look more holistically across, a whole swath of different mitigation strategies and a whole slew of, different types of hazard events. And so as you see from the table here, we have, 5 benefit cost ratios for different measures. And so, things like the regular adoption of building codes provide an 11 to $1 benefit, which is pretty significant. Above code activities, so sort of building off of that 11 to 1 actually provides a 4 to 1 benefit. They also looked at building retrofits, again, providing a 4 to 1 benefit. And then re-examining federal grants, this time not just from FEMA, but from the Economic Development Administration and HUD, and found a 6 to 1 benefit. And so I think this really sort of tells the story on the importance of pre-disaster mitigation and really investing upfront to hopefully sort of reduce those challenges, those costs, those impacts that we saw in the previous slides. I know we're going to talk a lot about sort of building code related strategies to support resilience, but I think it's really important to provide a community level context for resilience. Really sort of sending the message that building codes are an essential piece of resilience, but there are other policies and practices that need to be layered on top of building codes to be truly resilient at a community level. And so the picture at the left is post-Hurricane Ike in Galveston, Texas. You see sort of the lone home standing. That owner, did everything right. They met or exceeded building codes, but there's nothing else around them to support them. So likely no electricity, no clean water, no grocery stores, no schools. And so they've basically been sort of stranded. For folks in the New York area, certainly understand sort of the post-Sandy situation. And this particular picture on the top is the Goldman Sachs building. Again, they made the right investments for them. Kept the lights on, had generators, sandbags, sort of all of that activity at their own site. But the subway system was flooded. Nobody could get to work. And so, they sort of stranded their investment, was actually not able to sort of take advantage of the benefits that they hope to achieve. And then, finally, it's important to note that this is not, sort of limited to hurricanes or, windstorms, but, similar situations in wildfire and other hazards where, a whole community, save for, a couple buildings, may be wiped out. And again, you need to sort of think beyond just the individual building structures to support a community level of resilience. And that's really where the Alliance for National and Community Resilience is working. We identified 19 different community functions that cut across the social, organizational, and infrastructural aspects of communities to really look at sort of what makes communities great places to live and work every day. But also at the same time, what are the functions that really feed into that resilience at a community level that we were just talking about. And so we're actually in the process of developing benchmarks for each of these 19 community functions. We have the buildings, the housing, and the water benchmarks complete and are currently in the process of piloting those in Martinsville, Virginia, and Oakland Park, Florida. I think one of the key things, when we talk about particularly the buildings benchmark, it certainly relies heavily on building codes as sort of the foundational aspect of resilient buildings. And at the same time, sort of recognizing that buildings underlie almost all of these community functions in some form or another. And so, really sort of building out that interconnectivity, across all of these different community functions. We've also been doing a lot of work, primarily through ICC, to build out the case for why building codes are a key aspect of resilience. Often we like to say that a community cannot be resilient without resilient buildings and thus resilient building codes. But as I mentioned, there are a whole host of additional policies and practices that need to build off of that the basis that building codes provide. One thing that we have seen sort of moving into sort of that holistic approach to resilience, and particularly recognizing the social and economic aspects of buildings in communities, is really moving towards this concept of functional recovery. It's actually starting out within the seismic and earthquake community. But it's certainly an opportunity to bring, sort of a greater perspective to the role of codes in supporting community resilience. So as most folks, may know, currently building codes primarily focus on life safety issues. So assuring that, occupants within a building are protected from, electrical shock or, falling materials, or indoor air quality issues, and then also assuring that should a disaster event occur, that folks can get out of a building safely, that it's not going to fall down on them. But I think there's certainly an important recognition that even if folks can get out of a building after a hazard event, that building may lose its contribution to the community. So the folks that were housed in that building, the services that were provided out of that building may no longer, sort of be available to that community. And so functional recovery is really sort of setting up expectations on the survivability of that building and its ongoing ability to support the functions that it was designed to support. And And so really sort of figuring out, what are the important buildings and functions within a community and building that expectation into building codes. And so this is an ongoing effort to identify sort of what are the strategies to be able to achieve those goals. As I mentioned, initially seismic, but the expectation is that, many of the concepts and strategies, deployed in a seismic context would certainly apply, to additional hazards as well. I think another sort of key area that doesn't get maybe enough attention within the code space is sort of the intersection or the sort of duality of climate mitigation and hazard mitigation or climate adaptation, which is unfortunately a sort of a mix of terms which sort of need to be rectified across the hazard community and the climate community. But on the climate mitigation side, it's relying on things like energy codes to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and other requirements that lead to sort of that feedback loop on addressing hazard mitigation or climate adaptation. And so sort of really marrying the whole suite of codes to assure that we reach the optimal solution to address buildings. I'm sure folks have seen from many different communities, states, and localities, and now thankfully the federal government identifying goals to address greenhouse gas emissions, developing policies and practices. I think folks on the call probably recognize the role that buildings play in addressing those goals, and certainly the key piece of that is energy codes. And so really to address the needs that we've heard from communities on addressing energy efficiency and greenhouse gas reduction goals, ICC actually last week released a new framework to help advance things forward, including a new IECC scope and intent that would provide pathways to zero energy buildings, provide appendices to support additional greenhouse gas reduction strategies, assure that there's a robust cost effectiveness analysis as part of that, and really continue to advance and improve energy codes. Sort of sitting alongside the IECC, we've heard from many communities that they're looking at additional strategies to achieve their goals. So things like supporting electric vehicle charging, electrification, grid interactivity, the deployment of renewables. And so the Code Council will actually work to develop these particular resources to support those community needs. And then relying on an Energy and Carbon Advisory Council of leaders to assure that we're actually meeting the needs of communities, from a wide variety of perspectives. I think one other important area, as we're on the topic of energy codes, is really, sort of building out the case for, why energy codes are a key part of any resilience strategy. And so we've developed a series of white papers on the different codes and how they support resilience. I think on the energy code side, a few key areas of sort of resilience activity. So as we expect to see greater days with extended heat or extended cold, concepts like passive survivability, the ability to sort of stay in your home or office more comfortably over time, certainly reduces impacts on sheltering requirements, impacts on the grid, and the sort of the need to have sort of additional generation capacity on site, certainly impacts on durability. And as we'll talk about in a second, there's actually sort of a social resilience piece to this as well. So, there's certainly been some work by ACEEE and others to look at this concept of energy burdens. So, many households spend a significant proportion of their monthly income on things like energy. So marrying that with the costs of rental or mortgages, that's a significant burden on many households, particularly low income, people of color, older populations. The percentage of their income spent on energy costs is higher than the average. And you can sort of imagine what stress that puts on sort of daily decision making. And if we can sort of reduce those energy burdens through things like energy codes, hopefully that provides another layer of social resilience, particularly for these vulnerable populations. One area that we've seen, an increased focus on, and I know Peter's going to talk a little bit about this as well, is really embracing or really understanding future risk. So just as codes currently focus on life safety, they also base, a lot of their sort of risk analysis on past events. But I think folks are certainly increasingly recognizing that the events of the past are not necessarily illustrative of the impacts that we'll face in the future. And so you have folks like NAVFAC, DOD, American Society of Civil Engineers, AASHTO, and others really calling for an approach that addresses this future-focused risk. Some communities have actually taken that step, like New York City, and I know Peter will talk about that. But also, South Florida has identified, sea level rise projections to incorporate into their guidelines. And so the Code Council is really looking at, what can we do at a national level and even at an international level to assure that the codes moving forward can address, these particular challenges. And so we've actually brought together code development organizations from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to work together to really identify, what are the possible approaches, what are the current research gaps, and, sort of how we can work collaboratively to address this particular challenge. So I invite folks to check out globalresiliency.org, where we've captured some principles and we'll be providing, additional updates as this work moves forward. The first piece to come out of this dialogue is actually the report on the right. We undertook an effort within each of our countries and actually also within Germany, Netherlands, Norway, and Japan to really understand how codes currently use climate data. And so that's captured, in this first report, which you can get on the Global Resiliency page. The next step is really capturing what is possible. What are the various different strategies that folks are using today? What are some of the things that we could, pull together for future use to address changes in climate data and climate risk? And so we'll have a report based off of the surveys that we've done in that space available this summer. And then those two reports will actually form the basis for an international resiliency guideline that really provides the framework to assure that codes into the future can address these particular challenges. And then once the sort of international framework is developed, each of the code development organizations will go back to their standards and codes process to identify how to actually sort of operationalize the framework into their codes and standards. So certainly be on the lookout for increased development in this area. Certainly an area that needs attention. And I think as we started at the very beginning with sort of the trend lines on what we're seeing related to the number and cost of disasters, sort of pairing that with the expectation that they will continue to become more frequent, more severe, having the codes and standards in place to assure that we can address that changing risk is really essential. This is one sort of example of how a particular project, I know it's not from the building sector, but I think it's a great illustration of addressing climate risk and understanding that the risk may evolve into the future. And so designing into this rail bed the opportunity to quickly or sort of less expensively than sort of demolishing the whole thing, but sort of lifting the rail bed, adding an additional 5 or 6 feet, can address the changing risks relative to things like sea level rise. And then finally, just wrapping up, I want to touch on sort of one area that we're also working on relative to sort of adapting needs within the industry, within communities, recognizing that there are affordable housing challenges. The industry is certainly struggling with workforce related issues, and so we see offsite construction as really a strategy to address many of those different challenges. There's certainly a sustainability benefit there as well around material usage, and potentially as well a sort of resilience aspect due to the fact that you can get these projects up and in place quicker because you're doing the site development and the building construction at the same time. And so we're currently working on standards that will support this activity much more clearly. And those standards will be available this summer. And so you can find out some of the activities that we're doing around offsite construction on the offsite construction website of iccsafe.org/offsite. So I believe those are some of the sort of exciting and things that are going on within the Code Council to really recognize and address the challenges that we've seen. Communities are very much interested in addressing. So whether that's sort of the climate adaptation or climate mitigation side of the equation, hopefully this sort of builds out the importance of a holistic approach. So looking forward to the questions and the discussion that follows. So I'll turn it over to Peter.
Thank you, Ryan. All right, bring my screen up. All right, there we go. All right, let me know if you can't see it, but wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the invitation today, to Suzanne and Medea for having me speak, and thanks to Ryan for giving a really great overview and introduction, and really, I think, introducing the stakes and the goals here. What I'm going to do now is spending a little bit of time really diving in deep to what New York City is doing on this question of how we can design things resiliently in our capital program. We have a sort of a large suite of resiliency actions and policies and programs underway. And I really just want to talk about this one piece of it today, where we are thinking through what our capital program as the City of New York is and what it looks like today, and how we might need to change some elements of our design to make our schools, our police stations, our firehouses, our roads, our pumping stations, and everything else more resilient. And then really close by sharing how the work we're specifically doing now on our city capital program ties into a larger set of initiatives pushing towards where I think we have to go, which is towards a more resilient building code. So just a quick introduction. I work in the Office of Resiliency, and we work very closely with our sister office, the Office of Sustainability. And that Mobius strip diagram that Ryan showed earlier, is represented by our two offices, where the Office of Sustainability is working full time and really making impressive progress towards reducing the emissions that our city contributes, and trying to reduce the impact ultimately of climate change. In the Office of Resiliency, we're working more on the hazard mitigation side and really trying to ensure that the impacts of extreme weather that we already are at risk from and that are inevitable in the future, no matter how much we reduce our emissions, that the city is ready and as much as we can to address and mitigate those risks. And so it's a big job, takes on many forms, but I'll be talking now about how we really are trying to deal with shocks and stresses in the design of our capital projects. And it's really important right off the bat to distinguish between these two, because when we think about climate change, we really need to be ready for both. We have the big storms like Sandy, which hit the region and caused so much damage and devastation more than 8 years ago now. And those shocks are big in every sense of the word. They get a lot of attention. They bring often federal funding. They have a name. People talk about them and know about them. And we have to be ready for them. And Sandy really highlighted that we have a lot of work to do. And so in New York City, we have sort of our own set of shocks that we are really at risk from today and in the future. We have the big hurricanes and nor'easters, which we already are at risk from and which we think are going to become a bit more frequent. We're more likely to have bigger storms in the future. We also have other hazards that are getting worse, particularly long heat waves. Hotter temperatures in New York City for longer periods of time have a real impact on New Yorkers and on our built environment because we haven't designed for some of these hotter temperatures that we expect to see in the coming decades. At the same time, though, we also have to be ready for the stresses. And the stresses really are challenging in some unique ways because they are often not as big of an event. So really, by definition, they're not events. They are changes to the underlying conditions in the city. So that can manifest in a variety of ways. For example, we expect to have big heat waves in the future. Those could be shocks. But we also just expect to have higher average temperatures. It won't be a shock, it won't be a heat wave, but it will cause stress on our built environment, on the materials we've chosen, on our mechanical and heating and cooling systems. These systems are going to be more and more stressed. They're going to require more maintenance, and maybe earlier replacement because of the greater stress. We're having the same thing with flooding. We have the big storms, which are a problem, but we also increasingly have tidal flooding. And this is taken from a neighborhood in southern Queens where already coastal communities that are low-lying experience water in the streets, water in basements, and even in first floors when the tide is high. And this is going to keep happening and happen more frequently and cause huge disruptions to people's lives and to the schools that are there and to the garbage trucks that have to try to drive through this, or the buses that are already rerouting on certain days of the year because they know they can't drive through the high waters that are flowing in with the tide when the weather is otherwise great. So these shocks and stresses are real. They're problems today, and they're going to get worse in the future, and we have to do something about that. And so I want to discuss today our climate resiliency design guidelines, which are a standard that is has been in development and been refined for the last 4+ years to make sure that city capital projects are able to deal with those increasing loads, those shocks and those stresses. The guidelines are trying to answer that question of how do we design resiliently in New York City. They are focused on public buildings. These are not building code yet. These are not for private development yet, although many people are using them because they are, I've been told, a clear and useful standard, which is great to hear. But the real goal here is to make sure that the city capital program is resilient. And there's a couple of reasons why we're starting there and why I think that's really important. First off, city buildings are public buildings, and they are funded by public dollars. And we think that we have a responsibility as the city government to make sure that we are investing the public dollar in capital projects that is using the best data available. And so from our partners in the academic community, we have high quality, very local projections of what the future is going to look like with climate change here. And we need to use that data in design of our public projects because we are investing public dollars. And if we don't do this well, we're going to see a greater turnover in our capital projects. We're going to need more maintenance, more expensive replacement. And that's something we would like to avoid as much as possible. The other reason why, the more obvious reason why, is that these are public buildings providing public services. New Yorkers rely on the emergency services coming from our fire and police departments and our hospitals, the schools and public housing and libraries and museums and so many other types of buildings that New York City provides, provide essential services that New Yorkers require, and that are the kinds of buildings that need to be functioning before, during, and after disaster to the extent possible. And so starting with our public buildings and our public infrastructure, our roads and our sewer and water treatment plants, I think makes a lot of sense. And it's also a chance for the city to lead by example. I think in the future, everyone's going to have to follow these types of design standards when building code is updated, but it makes sense to begin with the city. So I'm going to talk a lot about the guidelines now, and you're going to see that the guidelines are primarily focused on a new design threshold, essentially. We are not telling folks that they need to elevate every building or that you need to specifically protect against heat in a different way. There are many design solutions to deal with these hazards. What we're doing with the guidelines is saying the code currently requires you to protect against this amount of heat or this amount of flooding. We have a new number, a new threshold to plan to, and it's based upon the climate data we have. And so the guidelines really just provide that number, that design standard, which then can be achieved in a wide variety of ways. And we encourage designers to meet those needs as necessary. And it's really important too when you think about the city capital portfolio, because we're not just talking about housing and schools, we're talking also about roads and parks and pump stations. And all of these have very different operational requirements. Some have occupants, some don't. Some are going to need, flood protection for a road ultimately is going to look very different than flood protection for a school. And our goal with the guidelines is not to tell our school construction authority or our Department of Transportation how to design a resilient road, but rather to say, you need to be able to withstand this level of stress from heat or rain or flooding. One of the other key organizing principles of our guidelines is the concept of useful life, which is that everything we're designing today is going to be around for a certain amount of time. We have sort of a design horizon, after which point we expect that the building might have to be completely gut renovated or maybe even replaced. It's a hard number to nail down, but it's a really important number to try to come up with for all of our projects, because something which is going to be around for a long time, like a brand new bridge or a monumental building like a museum, is going to experience more climate change. It's going to need to be designed to withstand a greater increase in the loads that it has to withstand. And a shorter lived building is just the opposite. So we want to make sure that when we are recommending that a building or a piece of infrastructure be designed to a resilient standard, that we are not over designing any more than we have to. And so by selecting the useful life of the building that is being designed or the piece of infrastructure, it gives us a chance to use the right climate projections for that useful life. So many things that are being designed today, many types of buildings in particular, are going to last till around the 2080s. And at that point, they will need to be fully overhauled. And so we need to be planning for 2080s climate. And when that is a certain level of heat, that's a certain level of flooding, a certain amount of sea level rise that we need to be ready for. And so understanding useful life and making sure that we're designing for the specific useful life of the project at hand is really important to make sure that we are getting the right amount of resilient design we need, but we're not over designing where possible. So just to give you a little snapshot as to how all this fits together, we already use climate data in our building code, and Ryan alluded to this a couple times. We look to the past, we look to history and say, oh, these are climate normals for this region. This is the weather that you get in New York City, and it's different than the weather you get in Las Vegas, and thus you build differently in one city or the other. That's invaluable. That's normal now. That was itself, of course, still once an innovation. And what we see now is a need for a new innovation to use that forward-looking climate data. Until the code gets there, though, we are using our guidelines for city capital projects to fill that gap, to use the historic climate data as a kind of baseline that is still informing the code, but to go beyond it with specific data for New York City that reflects our climate today and in the future, and interpret that through our guidelines so that we are complementing and going beyond the code requirements using the data that we have available. As I said, though, the guidelines that we've developed are ultimately just, like the code, providing a new standard that you need to design to. We're not going into all the details of exactly what a resilient road will look like. And we're leaving that flexibility to our partners in the agencies. And I think that's really important. It's something they really wanted, and I think something that makes a lot of sense because they are the experts in designing these things. We are giving them the policy direction, the new design standard target, and they're figuring out what it means for their agency. And so some agencies have begun to build on this and develop their own internal guidance to help them interpret our design guidelines. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And so we have this for housing now in New York City from our Housing Preservation and Development Agency, who have augmented and modified their sustainability standards to now include our resiliency standards as well. And that makes a lot of sense. It's an existing system. People know it. I'd love to see that our work can slot into that in a way that really works. Another key part of the guidelines is represented by this exposure screening tool. And what this key part of the guidelines is that we want them to be used from the beginning. If you have a project that is already in design and all of a sudden I show up and say, hey, you should use these guidelines, I've gotten there too late because now this project, if they're going to use the guidelines, has to go back and redo design work. And that takes time, that costs money. Nobody wants that. If the guidelines are going to be used effectively, if resilient design is going to be truly, realized in the city, we need it to be part of the capital scoping project from the very beginning. So that means that if you are putting out a design RFP, it needs to include the guidelines as one of the standards that the project will be designed to. If you are going to the Office of Management and Budget and requesting a funding allocation for a certain project, for a new school, let's say, we need to make sure that resiliency is included as part of that scoping, that the budget from the beginning has resiliency in mind. And our agency partners get this, our OMB gets this, and they all said we need a way to do that, basically. And so we created this exposure screening tool, which is really short, 2 pages, 10 questions, and you can use it at the very, very earliest stages of capital planning, when you really just know what you want to do. Is it a new building? What kind of building is it? Is it a substantial improvement or not? And where it is. And using that information, we can quickly figure out your exposure. We don't know yet if you need to make a big change to make your design more resilient. We don't know yet if what that change might be. All we know is that you are exposed, and your project needs to use the guidelines to figure out if a higher threshold needs to be designed to that accounts for changing climate. So now let's go quickly into what the guidelines actually look like. And as I've said before, it's providing that data, those numbers, for different useful life periods. So there's a lot of tables like this where we basically say, on the left side, you identify the end of useful life for your building, and the guidelines have already helped you do that. And on the right side, or for the rest of the column across the row, you then figure out what your design criteria will need to be. So if you are designing a new mechanical system in a building that has around a useful life of 30 years before you have to replace those mechanical parts, so we're looking to the 2050s. And then we have information for you about the number of heat events we expect to see, number of heat waves, more than tripling over the next 30 years, annual average temperatures going up. And very critically, things like the dry bulb temperature and the number of cooling degree days, where we expect to see some really significant temperatures. You, as a mechanical engineer, can then look at the system that you would typically use and determine, based upon its manufacturing specs and other criteria, can that system withstand these greater stresses? In many cases, we found it can, which is great because a lot of our mechanical systems are already over designed. But in some cases they can't, and that's something we need to know from the beginning and figure out what our solution needs to be. Doing this for each element of the project is just ultimately really vital to make sure that we are selecting materials, selecting sites, designing and selecting equipment that can really withstand the greater stresses we expect. On precipitation, we've been working really closely with our Department of Environmental Protection. It's our water utility and wastewater management utility to develop stormwater management rules to deal with the great increase in rainfall intensity that we expect to see. We initially had a table like the previous one for heat in the guidelines, but over the last few years in our development of the guidelines, the DEP has said, that makes a lot of sense. We're going to take those higher numbers and those greater requirements and just make it part of our normal stormwater management rules now. And that's really wonderful because I ultimately see the guidelines as a kind of vehicle in which we can identify a hazard, an issue, and put forward a resilient design solution, encourage people to use it in the city capital program. But ideally, these things are going to get picked up and used in a variety of places. It might be in the stormwater management rules. It might be in the building code. And I'll share some more insights into how we're getting there in the coming slides. The other thing I want to highlight is that we recognize that resilient design is, one among many competing priorities. And so part of the reason we've spent so many years really developing, first defining and then developing our resilient design goals is because we want to make sure that they're really complementary to everything else the city needs to do. And there are real challenges. It is, very hard to elevate a building or protect it against flooding and meet ADA requirements, but we have to do both. And so finding ways to tackle that is really important. We're increasingly thinking about the new impetus for healthy design and how can we build, buildings that, mitigate the risk of transmission of viral disease, but are also able to meet our goals around heat resiliency. There's some challenges there that we have to resolve. And so we use the guidelines as a venue and a vehicle to figure out some of these things. We also are very careful to think about our other just operational goals that we have in the city. And so in selecting stormwater management goals, we want to make sure that we are thinking about the type of drainage area you're in and whether or not we want to focus more on the treatment of the stormwater we're collecting or whether it's more about actual just detention and retention. And distinguishing between these two, depending on the drainage type, is crucial and something which the guidelines reflects. The last hazard I want to talk about is sea level rise, and it's the big one, the one that's on a lot of people's mind in the city, and one that often can have a really visible impact because a building will be built higher or will have a larger flood protection system. Everyone can see it, and it can make a huge impact, both positive and negative, and we have to try to find ways to mitigate the negative impacts. So what we do in the guidelines, again, is look at the useful life in the left column and say, a shorter lived building is going to need to plan for maybe 6 or 16 inches of sea level rise. A longer lived building is going to need to incorporate maybe 28, maybe 36 inches of sea level rise. And again, that makes sense, right? A building that's going to be around longer is going to experience a lot more sea level rise and its flood risk is going to grow. And we know how devastating that can be. So by incorporating this sea level rise adjustment into the existing code requirements, which tell you to look at the FEMA 1% map and tell you to add freeboard based on criticality, we're adding just an additional adjustment. So we're going beyond freeboard to provide an adjustment that allows us to account for sea level rise across the useful life of that building and to do so in a way that is hopefully really clear because there's already an existing system in the building code. This equation on your screen is a modified version of that existing equation. We want the sea level rise adjustment to slot into that as seamlessly as possible, to recognize the existing definitions of criticality, to recognize the existing flood map, to make it as seamless as possible. And this is our approach that we've developed for now. In addition, we also have some maps that depict this future flood risk. And these are a really important part of all of this work here, from the exposure screening tool to the establishment of a design flood elevation, because we're not just thinking about a greater flood depth and deeper flooding. We're thinking also about the extent of the future floodplain, and that's really important because if you are not in the current floodplain and we're building a new school somewhere, that school has no requirement to be protected against flooding. But with sea level rise, we know that it will be exposed to flooding in the coming decades. We need to address that now. And so understanding if a building is in the current or the future floodplain is really important. And then coming up with a design flood elevation that is specific to that level of risk is an integral part of the guidelines. The final hazard I'll talk about is a related one, which is just that tidal inundation I talked about before. Again, this is not the big flood event. This is not a big coastal storm. This is just high tide coming in, maybe at a monthly cycle, maybe at a seasonal or annual cycle. And we already have this in some communities where the water is coming in and it's just going to grow. This is a visual of Newtown Creek and the east side of Lower Manhattan. And by the 2080s, there's just going to be a lot of water coming into some of these coastal areas on a regular basis. We need to do a lot about this. And there are some solutions like raising edges that we can pursue. But we need to know about this when we are selecting a site for a new building in the city, because that building is going to be there for essentially forever. Maybe it'll get rebuilt at some point, but we're going to keep that site most likely. And so we need to be really careful about this when we're thinking about site acquisition, when we're thinking about new investments in existing sites. This is hard because there's just so little land to go around and we are really, space constrained. But we have to start considering this. And this is the first time we've begun doing that in these guidelines. So I'm going to wrap up quickly so we can get to the questions, but just a few final thoughts. We've been working on these guidelines for years. Version 4 is out right now, came out late last year. This has been a really iterative process. We've had input from tons of city agencies, all of our city capital agencies and others, to make sure these guidelines really work for them, that they have the resources and tools they need and give them the flexibility where they need it. And I've been really pleased to see those changes made and the document really gets strengthened over time. We've also done a lot of testing to figure out, why are we doing this and what are the benefits and how can we make it better? We've done our own cost benefit analysis and very similar to the results that Ryan shared, we see a real gain, a real positive, set of benefits, primarily in avoided damages and repairs. That is really valuable. And we've been able to, share these numbers with our Office of Management and Budget and help, with their support for this. And also at the same time, though, acknowledge that there are some added costs here. Sometimes we can do it pretty efficiently. Other times we are looking at an increased cost. Being able to demonstrate why that's valuable and why that helps the city save money and why it's a prudent investment is incredibly important. We've also developed and provided more tools that were requested by agencies, things like this risk assessment tool, which is not required, but is very useful in some cases, especially in those very big projects where an agency needs to figure out what to do with this new information and which sort of design solutions are going to help them meet the standard of the resiliency design guidelines. All right, so finally, next steps. And this is also the chance for me to tell you about how those design guidelines fit into a much bigger picture that we are working on. So I've spent the last several days intensely working with our friends over at the City Council who are extremely close to bringing to a vote legislation that will mandate these guidelines. And that is so exciting. We've been working on this for years. And now we are close to making these guidelines mandatory for city capital projects. So all these things I've been talking about have been used a lot voluntarily, and some agencies have kind of made it mandatory within their own process, which has been amazing. But we need to take that next step. And so the leadership and support we've been getting from our elected officials has been really great and really increasingly sophisticated as they see the value and the importance of this type of investment in our resilient capital projects. And so we're really close to getting these guidelines into a real mandate, into legislation, which is so exciting. That vote could happen as soon as next week. We had a public hearing earlier this year, And we've been getting a lot of really great support from a variety of corners. So it's great to see, and it's been a long time coming. But again, this is only one piece of the puzzle. I mean, the guidelines, as great as they are, we're focused on public projects, and a lot of other things are being built in the city all the time. So we have to do more to both support and ultimately, I think, require a higher standard of resilient design in the city. So there's a lot of things moving in that direction. One of them is a zoning update, which is in public review right now. Our Office of City Planning has developed this overhaul of our coastal resiliency zoning rules, which basically make it easier for people to design resiliently. There's a lot of restrictions right now about the envelope size of a building in a coastal area, and that makes it hard to elevate your building, let's say. Maybe you run into challenges around egress because of, again, zoning rules. We've learned a lot since Sandy, learned a lot about how we can improve zoning, and this update reflects, I think, a whole suite of options that are going to make it easier for everyone to build resiliently if they want to. And it's a really important part of the regulatory framework. DOB has also been making regular and very important updates to code, which some of them came right after Sandy and were made permanent a few years later. These updates, increase the freeboard levels basically, and have elected to use a more restrictive map because we have, for complicated reasons, 2 flood maps in New York City right now. We're using the more restrictive one wherever needed because we recognize that the flood risk is real, it's growing, and we need to do more about it. And so DOB has begun to make these requirements across the board, and there's DOB's at the very tail end right now of another code update process, which is going to make some further recommendations that will have to be adopted by council to further increase the protection levels there. And this is all really welcome, and it's slower than the changes in the guidelines, and I think that's important because we're still learning a lot about exactly the best way to define and pursue resilient design. But at the same time, we see an increased risk, so we have to do something. And these updates to the code so far reflect that need to do something while we learn more and really establish our goals for the next steps. So one of those big next steps, and this is something which I'm working on a lot right now, is future flood risk maps. I showed you some maps before. Those are maps that are publicly available on our Department of City Planning's website, and they're invaluable. I mean, they show us the future floodplain. However, they have some limits. They were designed using a pretty simplistic method. We want a more sophisticated map, ultimately. They were also designed with just some user challenges, essentially. Like they don't have all the data baked into them, so you can quickly figure out the flood elevation. It's a little more cumbersome to figure out how sea level rise ties into it. We need a map that's more sophisticated and a little bit easier to use, and that's also targeted for designers. And so we are developing future flood risk maps. This will take a couple of years to finish, but they're ultimately going to be a map that has sea level rise baked right in, that allows you to select your useful life of your building, that tells you which flood map to use, and you can immediately see, am I or am I not in the floodplain? Am I, and ultimately, what flood zone am I in? Is it a high action wave zone or a zone without waves? It also allows you to see the depth of elevation, and then you could more quickly figure out your design flood elevation. It's going to be a really valuable tool, and it's the kind of thing that we really need, a new flood reference map, if we're going to bring resilient design into the building code in a way that could bring the same kind of standard and thinking of the design guidelines to all public and private projects. And that's the long-term goal, is in the future years to really take all these things that we've learned, all of these different improvements we've made, as well as everything we're learning from our friends at the ICC and in other municipalities and from around the world, to really get our hands around what we mean when we say we want to design resiliently, and to find a way to bring that into our regulatory framework in a way that is clear, fair, equitable, and ultimately really effective at addressing this growing risk that we all face. So I encourage you to check out the guidelines. They are publicly available at nyc.gov/resiliency, and stay tuned in the next week or two as council brings this legislation to a vote and hopefully makes these guidelines mandatory. So thank you.
So thank you, Ryan and Peter. If you could just address the PDH questions first. We've got a lot of questions from the audience and participants, which we want to get to, but we thought we'd cover the PDH credits first. Could you handle that for us?
I don't know if I have them here.
I do. I can put them in the chat to you.
Okay.
All right, here they come.
Yes, Peter, this one's yours.
Oh, so I read it out? Okay. So yes, just some questions for credit for this lecture. So the first question is, yeah, please name any 2 of the extreme weather or climate hazards that New York City is planning for. And the answer's there too.
But they can't see that. That's just.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay, good. All right, good. So yeah, number 1, name any 2 of the extreme weather or climate hazards that I talked about. Number 2, what kinds of projects does New York City use these climate resiliency design guidelines on?
Oh, and you're getting answers too, so you can in the chat. Can you see? You can see that, right?
I can see the answers. Yeah.
We've got sea level rise and hurricanes came in, flooding and wind came in.
All correct. And yes, Eric, you're right. We're using capital buildings, capital city capital projects. That's what we're focused on the guidelines. Exactly right. And my third question, and then I'll hand it over to Ryan, is describe why accounting for useful life is important in the context of these climate resiliency design guidelines.
I don't see any answers coming in for that one, so feel free. Oh, here's one. All right.
Right. So yeah, to not overbuild for future conditions. Right. Assisting assessment of future risks. All correct. Exactly. Right. The useful life gives us insight into, the specific climate future of the building we are planning for. And so knowing how long we expect the building to be around lets us know what our load tolerances are that we need to plan for. All correct. Thank you. All right, Ryan.
Okay, so the next one's mine, yeah. Besides the life safety of buildings, what resilience concepts would functional recovery requirements advance? I don't see any answers yet. But we did talk about the importance of social and economic resilience that buildings provide beyond the life safety aspects. And then we talked about energy codes. So how do energy codes support resilience? And there's certainly a few different ways that I talked about.
There's a couple answers popping in.
Yeah. Yep. So certainly greenhouse gas emissions is a key part of that. Heat impacts, exactly. comfort. Yeah, so certainly all of those are benefits that we see from implementation of energy codes. So thanks, everybody.
So excellent. There are several questions in the Q&A, and then there's also something in the chat window. Do you want us to read them to you, or do you want to kind of access them yourselves? And then, of course, you have the raise hand opportunity for people to raise their hands and ask you questions. Did you want to start out with, there were two questions in the chat window, or I'll let you decide which is the best to do.
Might be hard to find that now. Let's find those.
I see a question here from Lewis, who asks, I wonder two things. What if we become good stewards of the environment and still levels do not rise? And two, has there been any consideration taken for how these policies might incentivize developers to start constructing buildings that will be more temporary so they can avoid investments in building for resiliency? So, yeah, I mean, the good stewards question is, you're an optimist, and I like it. I mean, I think the reality, though, is that what we see from the climate science is some amount of change is just locked in. And even if we all completely overhaul our energy economy tomorrow and change our land use policies and really, really dramatically slow the impacts of climate change, I mean, that will be incredibly beneficial and will have many long-term benefits. But there will be some changes that are just locked in and we're still going to have to deal with. And so even in that optimistic scenario, we would still have a need for resiliency. I mean, we see that need already, right? I mean, the way Sandy impacted New York City and the way this cold snap impacted Texas, like there's a lot of real risks to our built environment that we're not prepared for already. And sea level rise and climate change and the rest of it are going to aggravate those existing challenges. And so we have a lot to do. And we need to do both. We need to do everything we can to mitigate these long-term changes, but accept the fact that there are some changes locked in and we have to begin to address them. The question about incentivizing developers to start constructing buildings that will be more temporary. Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I mean, particularly in areas that are like at risk from that like tidal flooding, right? Like where the water will be flowing in every day in the future, and maybe there's no way to keep that water out for geologic or geographical reasons. It's just hard to do. We just haven't gotten there yet because asking people to design sort of with impermanence in mind just kind of goes against the whole industry and the way people sort of live and operate in neighborhoods. People buy land and they invest in the land and they plan to stay there for a long time. And it's certainly an interesting idea though, and one we've begun sort of playing around and considering with, but we haven't seen a lot of really good examples of. And yeah, if anyone knows of any good case studies for that, I'd love to see it. Please share it in the chat.
Yeah, and I think that's really sort of a good opportunity for the concept of design for adaptability. So if you are sort of concerned about sort of the long-term impacts, but you don't want to make sort of the full investment in mitigation measures for the long term, but if you think about them sort of early in the design, you can build in sort of strategies that as climate changes, as risk changes, you can sort of make a investment in the building to sort of activate those adaptations that you designed in initially. And I think that may actually answer sort of both of your questions.
All right, so there's something in the chat window that came in at 1:40. I believe taking into account the useful life of the building is practical. Although along those same lines, have you taken into account the natural economical turnover of the building's usefulness, such as changing for a new occupancy, or even along the lines of improving building technology, such as better insulation or windows that make it more economical to renovate?
Yeah, I think this actually ties back to what Ryan was just saying, but designing for adaptability is crucial just so that we can respond to changing conditions as we learn more about them. Where all this information we have on future conditions has some uncertainty to it, and we are doing the best we can to manage that uncertainty and make good design decisions with it. But there's always going to be things we get wrong, and having a design that is more adaptable, that can respond to changing conditions is really ideal, as well as, one that can incorporate, new technologies that might address some of these challenges, particularly around extreme heat. So we're trying to encourage that thinking wherever we can, but it's been difficult to find like ways to regulate it or mandate it. Instead, we try to create in the guidelines like that type of thinking by just saying like, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. Here are like why adaptable solutions are recommended because they will give you that kind of flexibility in the future.
Yeah, I think one of the key things is, looking sort of at these opportunities for sort of triggering events. So, if someone is doing a remodel or a change in occupancy, assuring that the code is sort of set up to take advantage, of those time periods where it is sort of less expensive to improve. And so looking at things like the existing building code to sort of incorporate, many of those things that, could be easily or sort of less expensively updated, during a renovation or tenant build out or, sort of all of those sort of triggering type of events.
Okay, so we have a question from Lieutenant Colonel Ben Wallen. What is the most effective technique determined to engage stakeholders and increase compliance and improvements for pre-existing issues?
I don't know if you want to take that, Ryan, but I mean, for me, it's demonstrating the value, like pointing to case studies of when that investment in resilient design brought, avoided damages or some other type of benefit. Really being able to point to, the material quantitative difference of resilient design, that it's not just about, feeling good or being ready for some uncertain thing. It's about being able to withstand or bounce back more quickly from a disaster and being able to show why that matters to the building owner, to the occupants, to the community that might depend on it.
Yeah, I think that's certainly important. And I think, when you're talking to businesses, things like potential business interruption, could be sort of help make that case. I think another area that we're exploring, but haven't sort of totally built out the case is getting sort of the perspective from insurance and finance community as well, because they often also have sort of resources tied up in different properties. Take a mortgage, for instance, is 30 years. If that building is no longer standing, it's probably likely that the homeowner will default. And so, identifying areas where, mortgage financiers can, sort of provide additional impetus for, retrofits, I think would be important as well. And then identifying sort of a robust incentive program. We've seen incentive programs in California for seismic retrofits, and really sort of recognizing, the benefits that provides both to the community and to, the individual homeowner or building owner.
Okay, we have a question from Fatima Kani. Thanks for a wonderful presentation, and the planning looks promising. What are the resilient codes for existing buildings, infrastructure in New York City that are in critical state, but cannot be overhauled, demolished as yet?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's the other side of the coin, right? Like everything I described is, New York City trying to improve its capital planning process, and so we're taking the projects, the school renovations or the new public housing or whatever it might be, that's already in the pipeline. We know it's coming. It's been talked about for years, and now we're just saying, hey, let's make sure we do that right. Let's make sure we do this renovation or this new construction in a way that's going to be resilient. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. I mean, the city has an enormous capital portfolio. And so we are at the very earliest stages of just trying to figure out which parts of that portfolio are more or less vulnerable to extreme weather today and in the future, and try to be proactive in that way so that we can say, okay, this piece of infrastructure that is not up for renovation or replacement for 20 years is in fact at greater risk. We know that it might be facing a different, a greater or increasing hazard. we need to push that up the queue. Like this needs to become, resiliency needs to become a new part of our capital planning list of priorities. And it's always going to be one among many competing priorities, but it needs to be a bigger part of it. And so we're at the earliest stages of moving in that direction, but it's a good question and one that we've got to do more on.
Okay, so the next question is to Ryan from Eric Bacchus at Clarkson University. Ryan, can you explain the new IECC process and how this will improve the IECC, and what concerns might be looking for with this new process, especially as many groups were against the change in process?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, as I mentioned in the presentation, we've seen a lot of communities, setting goals around energy efficiency and greenhouse gas reduction strategies. So we certainly wanted to, reflect that need, provide resources, for communities that are looking to address those particular challenges. With respect to the process itself, sort of with all of those demands, with all of the sort of changes that are occurring in technology in the energy space, we felt like it would be sort of more conducive to an effective and adoptable approach through the Energy Code to move towards a standards development process, which really allows for more collaboration. The existing or the previous process for the IECC was really sort of a binary type of process of something comes in or out, and there wasn't really an opportunity to sort of discuss the merits or the potential to have sort of a middle ground that could meet a variety of different concerns. And so the standards process would be more deliberative to really address those challenges. And then certainly as we shift to a standards development process, government voices are a key part of that. And so we've taken steps to assure that they remain a strong voice in that development process. I would suggest actually going to iccsafe.org/energy. We have some FAQs there. There's some infographics. You can look at the whole framework. This will certainly be a conversation that will go on for a little while. But hopefully at the end of the day, as the 2024 edition of the IECC is developed, that we'll see sort of the fruits of this new framework and this new approach.
Okay, so from Colonel Joe Prevecchio, 3-foot sea level rise by the year 2100 seems incredible. What is the basis for that prediction? And how can the guidelines be adjusted as scientific evidence matures?
Yeah, so 3 feet are a lot, but it's actually the middle range of the projections that we have in front of us, where by 2100 we expect in New York City to see around between 1 and 6 feet. That's the range that we have, and it's a big range. And 3 feet is in the middle of it, and that's where sort of the highest confidence is in the results we have. We get this data from this panel called the New York City Panel on Climate Change. It's a local group that was appointed by the previous mayor, Bloomberg, and has been continued and really strengthened by the current mayor, de Blasio. And it's an invaluable group because they basically are some of the leading climate scientists in the world. They take the data we have available from the global bodies, the national bodies, and the academic literature, and together are able to come up with local projections that give us an insight into what New York City's climate is going to look like in the coming decades. They check and refine their work every couple of years, and their predictions for sea level rise over the last 14, 15 years now have been really consistent, and reflect what we know in the science. And so our job in our office is to take that science and those projections and say, okay, well, what do we do with this? We have a big range of potential outcomes, and we've chosen different things about different hazards. But when it comes to sea level rise, we want to build resiliently, and that means planning for maybe not the worst case scenario, but at least a moderate scenario. Also relying on the freeboard that the code requires to help us deal with some of that uncertainty, but trying not to overbuild because of the extra costs and the real impacts that just an elevated building or a building with higher flood protection can have. But yeah, this is tough. But fortunately, we have a lot of precedents for this. I mean, the code update process is always ongoing, and we already update the code on a regular basis based upon new historic climate data. As norms shift, ASHRAE is always adjusting its climate zones, and we need to keep doing that using forward-looking climate data. And so our job is to make sure we have good data, to make sure that we select it well, and that we manage the risk and uncertainty as best we can, and stay really closely aware of changes in the projections and in the science, and adapt both our guidelines and ultimately the building code as we learn more.
Okay, we just have time for really one more question, and we have two questions that are being asked, but they're very similar. And so they're talking about the New York City resilience guidelines extending to private developers, and how accommodating can you find the response of developers and builders in terms of increased initial costs and finances for incorporating these codes?
Yeah, it's a wide range of responses. But one thing we're already seeing in New York and Miami and across the world really is that resilience is becoming a feature in some types of developments. You could find luxury developments on the east side of Manhattan and in Miami and other places where, like, the fact that they have a really great energy system and it's elevated really high is a feature on the real estate website. And that's great. I mean, I love to see that. It underlines the importance for New York City to make sure that resiliency isn't just a luxury feature, that it's something which becomes part of just design standards, because everyone deserves to have that right to a reliable building, a reliable school, a reliable service. And so we need to make sure that happens. And that's why we're really starting with our own capital program. But it's great to see that interest in the private sector, and I think it's going to continue to grow. There are challenges, though. There are lots of developers who are not luxury developers who are only going to build to code and not go beyond it unless they have to. And so this is our job for the next few years. We've spent a lot of time figuring out what resilient design is and what it should be for the city. Now we have to figure out what it should look like for private development. It's going to be a little different, and it's going to probably require some real investments in, in the tools, the resources, maybe hopefully we could find ways to even, financially support, the kinds of investments we think are necessary. So it's a lot of work to do. We have to figure a lot of that out. I'm glad to see the early interest from the private sector. But we have to, we have to go down that road.
Well,
I think that's a great segue to your next event around rating systems and sort of how do you pull the market, towards identifying and investing in these strategies. So I think we've certainly teed up the conversation for next month.
And so everybody has to register for that and attend that as well. I do want to thank the committee, U.S. Green Buildings Council and SAME. We have Medea Villar here, and myself, Suzanne DiGeronimo. Also online is Lieutenant Colonel Ben Wallen, U.S. Military Academy of West Point. On the call today was Eric Bacchus, Clarkson University, and also Colonel Joe Pravecchio of Carbon Key, and Mike Scarano of New Jersey Transit. So it's a good group, and thank you both for an excellent presentation.
Thank you very much.
And look out for my email, everyone. It'll have the link to the survey, which also includes the questions for the PDHs. And I'll follow up about GBCI credits and our future events. It'll have links to all the future events. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye.